Here are some SAS functions for working from one observation to the next across variables as opposed to working down columns. So here's a data set. I've got a few missing observations so you can see what's going on. When I run this data sums, I've got several different ways of taking sums across variables. I can say x1 plus x2 plus x3 plus x4, or I can sum up x1 through x4 in a couple of different ways. These are just two ways of writing the same thing. They'll give me exactly the same output. They're calculated in the same way. It's just that this first one gives me a little bit of a shortcut in terms of syntax. So if I run this, this is what happens. See how I got some missing values over here? That's what happens when you just do things by hand. If you do any kind of operation to something with a missing value, you end up with a missing value in the end. On the other hand, this sum function is designed to take into account missing values, and it'll just keep adding. You can do the same thing with a mean statement. When you're calculating means by hand, when you have missing values, you'll end up with a missing value, whereas the other two methods give us actual means across columns, not taking into account the fact that that was missing. So what it's going to do is it's going to say 0.5, for example, plus 8 is 8.5, and it takes into account the fact that there are two missing observations. So instead of dividing by 4, it's going to divide by 2 in order to get 4.25. So it'll take your means in the way that you would expect it to take means. Here are several different ways of rounding things. You can round off. The default setting is to round off to the nearest integer. So we know x1 has a value 13.75. It's going to round that to the nearest integer, which is 14. This is another way of saying the same thing, and this specifies, let's give it another decimal place. So it's going to round that 13.75 up to 13.8 because we want to round to the nearest single decimal place. This will give us a rounding to 2 decimal places. An int is a slightly different function. It seems to look like rounding, but what it's actually doing is it's just taking the integer part of some number. So if we have 13.75, it'll just grab the integer, which is 13. It doesn't do any kind of rounding at all. So when I run this, that's what happened. I just rounded off for these numbers. I rounded to the nearest whole number, whereas the int function just takes the integer part. And the integer part of 0.5 is 0. Here are a few common numeric functions for your work. Just in case you're interested, there's a square root function, exponential, absolute value, sine, cosine, and tangent. The int function we just discussed. The log function, you have to be careful with. It's log base e, not log base 10. There's a log 10 if you want log base 10. A max, min, mean, sum, and round.